There is a place that every crusader dreamed of conquering but dared not speak of aloud. A name that echoed through their prayers and curses alike. Not Jerusalem, not Acre, not Antioch, but Mecca, the very heart of Islam. A city so sacred, so fiercely guarded, that even the thought of laying siege to it bordered on heresy or suicide. And yet, in the forgotten shadows of history, there was one crusade, one reckless, vengeful, and nearly successful expedition that came closer to reaching Mecca than any army of the cross before or after. This is the story they never wanted written. A crusade buried not because it failed, but because of how close it came to igniting the unthinkable. It began in the aftermath of disaster. The year was 1221. The Fifth Crusade, aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem by striking Egypt first, had ended in utter failure. Led by Pelagius, a papal legate, and supported by King John of Brienne and the Knights Templar, the Crusaders had marched on the Nile city of Damietta with great confidence. They captured it, they held it, and then they lost everything. Caught in the floodwaters of the Nile and crushed by the armies of Sultan al-Kamil, thousands of knights were drowned, slaughtered, or taken prisoner. Their surrender was humiliating, their cause disgraced, but not all of them returned to Europe. A small force, led by a furious and excommunicated nobleman named Reynald de Châtillon, refused to accept defeat. Reynald had been captured before in an earlier campaign and had spent years rotting in a Muslim prison. Released only after swearing oaths he never intended to keep, his hatred had fermented into something darker. He believed the war should not end at cities like Jerusalem or ports like Acre. He believed the only way to end the threat of Islam was to strike at its source, to desecrate its holiest place. And this time he had nothing to lose. With a band of mercenaries, outlaws, and rogue knights, Reynald left the main crusading forces and headed east and south. He had maps, some taken from dead merchants, others whispered by desperate prisoners. According to some accounts, he had even bribed Bedouin guides to lead him through the Red Sea route. His goal: to reach Mecca by land, disguised at first, and then strike hard and fast before any army could stop them. He called it vengeance. Others would later call it madness. What we know comes not from Christian records. They are eerily silent on Reynald's final expedition, but from Arab chroniclers who preserved the story with both horror and grim fascination. The first sign of the approaching raiders came near Tabuk, where a caravan was attacked and slaughtered. The attackers spoke a strange mix of French, Latin, and broken Arabic. They carried black crosses, but wore stolen robes. Their leader was described as tall, pale, and fanatical, with eyes that never blinked. Then came the assault on Yanbu, a port city on the Red Sea. It wasn't a full invasion, just a raid. But it was brutal. Women and children were taken. Shrines were burned. And on the walls of a mosque, they left a message scrawled in blood. The cross will cast shadow over your Kaaba. Panic spread through the Hejaz. Pilgrimage routes were closed. Alarms rang in Medina. Mecca had never faced a foreign army since the early days of Islam. The idea that crusaders, infidels from the far west, were not only in Arabia but moving south toward the holiest of cities, sent shockwaves across the Muslim world. Sultan al-Kamil, still in Cairo, acted swiftly. He sent riders across the desert and called upon every tribal and local force available to block the path. The desert became a trap, and Reynald's army, already low on supplies and suffering from the blistering heat, began to wither. But they pushed on, driven not by strategy, but by religious fury and a death wish wrapped in righteousness. It is believed that they reached within 5 days' march of Mecca, close enough to smell the spice-laden winds of the inner Hejaz, close enough that the city's defenders began preparing for a siege no one had imagined possible. And then they vanished. Some say they were ambushed in the night by a coalition of Bedouin warriors and Mamluk cavalry. Others claim Reynald and his men fell victim to poisoned wells and mirages, tricked by their guides, betrayed by thirst and heat. One haunting account describes a field of bodies, sun-bleached and naked, with crosses carved into their chests, not by their enemies, but by their own hands, as if offering themselves in sacrifice. The survivors, if any existed, were never heard from again. And yet, the attempt itself left a scar. The Mamluks would later fortify key routes to Mecca, install more patrols, and spread warnings among the tribes. And Reynald de Châtillon, already infamous, would become a ghost of hatred, not just for what he did, but for what he almost did. But here's the twist. This was not Reynald's first time trying to attack Mecca. A decade earlier, he had attempted a naval assault through the Red Sea, sending Christian ships southward with plans to bombard the port of Jeddah and reach the city by sea. That attempt failed when his fleet was ambushed and destroyed. But this second land-based attempt came terrifyingly close. So close, in fact, that one Mamluk officer is quoted as saying, "Had the wind blown kinder, we would have buried the cross beside the Kaaba." And yet, this story is absent from most Western chronicles. It doesn't appear in crusading sermons or in Vatican archives, at least not openly, because it was a crusade without papal blessing, a mission drenched in revenge rather than redemption. And perhaps because if it had succeeded, it would have ignited a religious firestorm the world might not have survived. So why don't we remember it? Because it wasn't convenient, because it didn't fit the image of noble knights and holy missions, because it revealed the raw, unfiltered fanaticism that lurked beneath the banners and prayers. And yet it happened, a rogue crusade led by a madman that almost reached the beating heart of Islam. And we have to ask, if history hides something this massive, what else is it still hiding? Thank you for watching CIHUYS. Some stories were buried not because they were false, but because they were far too true.